The end result of this campaign is that it has caused Putin to wage the war more aggressively against Ukraine. And most importantly, the Russians have shut down the Odessa port complex on the Black Sea, and they've shut down all of the Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea, which effectively means that Ukraine is now a landlocked country. This is disastrous for Ukraine. Before the war started, about 90% of Ukrainian exports went through the Odessa ports. 90%. And no, I take that back. 90% of the agricultural goods went through Odessa, and about 70% of the overall exports went through Odessa. These are remarkable numbers. And you remember the Russians shut down Odessa. They shut down the Black Sea between February 24th, 2022, when the war started, and July, a few months later. And during that February to July 2022 window, the Russian caused enormous damage to the Ukrainian economy. And fortunately for Ukraine, a deal was worked out under the auspices of the UN and Turkey that led to the reopening of the port or the ports in the Odessa area in July of 2022. That was manna from heaven for the Ukrainians. Well, fast forward to the present, what the Russians have done is they've shut down the Odessa port complex. They've shut down all of the Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea. This is going to have devastating economic consequences. And it's not like Ukraine is a country that is in good economic shape at this point anyway. In fact, enormous damage has been done to the Ukrainian economy over the course of this war, and this will just make a horrible situation much worse. So there's no question that the Ukrainian long-range drone campaign has inflicted pain and caused problems for the Russians. No doubt about that. But the Russians have retaliated, and they are able to cause much more pain for the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians can cause for the Russians. So this escalation does not work to Ukraine's advantage. In fact, I would argue it works to Russia's advantage.
After years of war, the biggest question isn't who launched the latest attack. It's whether every new escalation is making the final outcome even worse. Professor John Mearsheimer argues that Ukraine's latest strategy may have triggered a much harsher Russian response, while the West is running out of realistic options. Whether you agree or disagree, his argument challenges one of the biggest assumptions about where this war is headed.
And by the way, it's not just the shutting down of Ukraine's ports on the Black Sea that matter here. The fact is, if you look at what the Russian air offensive against Ukraine is doing, it's also targeting all sorts of infrastructure, all sorts of places where drones and military equipment is produced inside of Ukraine. It's shutting down gas stations all across eastern Ukraine, making it almost impossible for a vehicle to drive from point A to point B because there's no gas available. The Russians are targeting railroads and locomotives and so forth and so on. So the end result of this air campaign that the Russians are now escalating because of what Ukraine is doing is to speed up the process of Ukrainian defeat. So I think there's no question that Russia will suffer some pain, but in the end, the Ukrainians will suffer more pain, and it will speed up Ukraine's defeat.
I guess the whole logic though of increasing the pain on Russia, hoping that they will somehow capitulate, it seems to be flawed for the same reason measuring success in Iran in terms of death and destruction is it's the same flaw, because if they see this as an existential threat, Yeah, the only response would be escalation. But I thought it was interesting though that Ukraine began to attack all these ships, Russian ships in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. I thought it was strange because the whole, not a complete Black Sea ceasefire, but all the remnants of this grain deal, that is not to attack each other's ships. It looked like it was a good deal for the Ukrainians. It was just strange to see them opening up this massive front, and also the celebration across the Western media that all these Russian ships were being hit. One could have predicted what would be the consequence. That is, it looks as if now, Ukraine is being, it's become a landlocked country de facto. I was just wondering, what is the next play here then for NATO and Ukraine? Will they look to ceasefire in the Black Sea, or because Ukraine as a landlocked country is not going to do very well?
No, it's a disaster economically. There's no question about it. And as I said, Ukraine is a country that was in desperate straits economically, even before this Russian campaign against Odessa ramped up. I mean, what's going to happen here is that as a result of the air war, uh, Ukraine's economy, its infrastructure is going to be wrecked. And at the same time, the Russians are going to steadily improve their situation on the battlefield. They're already doing that. It's quite clear that they're going to control all of Donbass by the end of this year. And I think at this point, the only interesting question is how much territory the Russians ultimately end up taking. I think in the end, they'll take Odessa. And the incentives to do that are clear from what we were just saying about the effects of turning Ukraine into a landlocked country. You want to remember here, the Russians, I believe, are not in a position to win a decisive victory and conquer all of Ukraine. They would be remarkably foolish to attack into Western Ukraine. And the end result is you're going to get, I believe, in the end, a rump Ukraine state. And you want that rump state to be as economically weak as possible if you're the Russians. You want it to be a dysfunctional rump state. That will be Russia's goal. Russia's goal will be to conquer lots of territory and not get bogged down in territory that's mainly populated by ethnic Ukrainians. And then that make sure that rump state that's left, that rump Ukraine, is dysfunctional. And taking the Black Sea ports is a major step in that direction. So I think what's going to happen here is that the war is going to play itself out. It's going to be settled on the battlefield, and the Russians are going to win an ugly victory, not a decisive victory. They'll win an ugly victory. And you'll get, a frozen conflict at some point in time. I think that's the direction that you're headed in. And I don't see how the Ukrainians can turn this around. As you know, Glenn, there is a huge amount of attention paid, even in the Ukrainian press, to the fact that the army is suffering a significant manpower problem due to draft dodging and to the large number of soldiers who run away from the battlefield, who are AWOL, as we say here in the United States. So they don't have much manpower up on the front lines. And everybody admits that this is a huge problem. And when you look at the state of the decision-making process inside of Ukraine, it looks like it's a total mess. Zelensky has just gotten rid of the Minister of Defense. He's just gotten rid of his commanding general. They have new people in place, and it's not clear how this all fits together. I mean, the last thing you want to do if you're Ukraine is at a critical point in the war like this is have this political fiasco that leads to the firing of sort of what I would call, aside from Zelensky, the two key decision makers in the national security process. But that's where they are. So I think when you look at what's happening on the battlefield, the fact that the Ukrainian front line is buckling and that the bombing campaign has now been ramped up and is working in major ways to Russia's advantage. And then you look at the political situation inside Kyiv, especially with regard to the commanding general and the minister of defense. You can't help but conclude that Ukraine is in really deep trouble.
Ukraine's latest long-range strikes were intended to increase pressure on Russia. But Professor John Mearsheimer argues they may have produced the opposite effect. He says Moscow has responded by escalating the conflict in ways that could inflict even greater economic and military pressure on Ukraine. Whether you agree with his analysis or not, his central argument is that escalation doesn't automatically improve a country's position and may instead reshape the battlefield in favor of its opponent.
I think it's hard to say exactly how this ends and when it ends. And the reason is drones. I think if there had been no drones in this conflict, the Ukrainians would have lost a long time ago. What's really saved them is the appearance of huge numbers of drones up on the front line that have basically forced the Russians to move very slowly and very carefully, and have allowed the Ukrainians to compensate for the fact that they're badly outnumbered in terms of troops on the front line, and furthermore, that they don't have enough troops to thickly populate the forward lines. Absent drones, this would be catastrophic for Ukraine. But given the presence of large numbers of drones up on the front lines, the Ukrainians have done a quite good job, especially when you take into account the fact that they're so outnumbered, in holding off the Russians, or let's put it this way, slowing down the Russians. So, given the presence of drones, the Russians are making progress for sure, but not rapid progress. Now, Putin would like to see rapid progress. Whether that happens remains to be seen because of the presence of drones. But nevertheless, I think that the Ukrainians are doomed up on the front lines. So that would be my main point. The question I have for you is, you talk about Trump sort of deciding now that he is going to once again support Ukraine. As we both know, he's gone back and forth on this issue. But if you look at what happened at the G7 meeting in June in France, and then in early July at the NATO meeting in Ankara, it looked like Trump was impressed with what the Ukrainians were doing. He had bought into the propaganda campaign that said Ukraine had the Russians on their back feet. And he sort of threw his lot in with the Ukrainians. Okay. But the question I have for you is, so what? What is Trump going to do? Is he going to give the Ukrainians more weapons? Is he going to give them more patriots? That's meant as a joke, right? What are we going to do? Do we have the weaponry to give the Ukrainians? Is Trump showing any interest in giving them many, many millions of dollars? No. I mean, he'll continue to give them intelligence support, but we've been doing that all along, as you well know. So even if Trump has changed his mind, does it matter? And with regard to the Europeans, are they going to up the ante and do more to help Ukraine? What are they going to do? They've been giving them as many drones as they can. They've been giving them intelligence. They've been egging them on. They've helped formulate this propaganda campaign that's designed to help Ukraine. But as you and I were saying at the top of the show, has basically backfired. What are they going to do? The situation, not to talk about the Middle East now, but the situation is analogous to the problem that Trump faces with Iran. What is he going to do? What's the magic formula? There is no magic formula. We can talk about this later, of course, but there's no magic formula that Trump can turn to win the war against Iran. And there's no magic formula that the West, to include the United States, can turn to help Ukraine when it's war. In fact, all we're doing in this whole process, as you and I have argued for God knows how long, is making sure that Ukraine loses more territory, suffers more casualties, and ends up as a truly dysfunctional state.
According to John Mearsheimer, Russia's response has expanded far beyond the battlefield. He argues that strikes on infrastructure, transportation, energy networks, and logistics are steadily increasing the pressure on Ukraine's economy and military. He also points to manpower shortages and political instability in Kyiv, concluding that these combined factors place Ukraine in an increasingly difficult position. Whether viewers agree with this assessment or not, it establishes the central argument that the remainder of the interview builds upon.
Let me add one other dimension to the basic scenario that you described, and that is that the Europeans especially, but the United States as well, or at least key elements in the United States, believe that Russia is a mortal threat to them. So we're not only talking about the Russians defeating Ukraine and threatening the future of Ukraine. We're talking about the Russians being in a much better position to threaten a conquest of Eastern Europe or maybe even more of Europe. And I don't believe that's true, but many in the West believe that that's true. That makes the situation that the West will face when Ukraine eventually gets defeated in Donbass all that more scary, all that more dangerous. And that then feeds into your question, what will the West do? Um, what will the West do if, the Russians find themselves in a position where the Ukrainian army is beginning to crumble? This is a very real possibility. I mean, this often happens in protracted conflicts. This is what happened to the German army in the late summer and early fall of 1918. It was a formidable fighting force when it launched the Ludendorff offensives in March 1918. In fact, people worried that the Germans would win the war in March 1918. And of course, the war ends on November 11, 1918, with a devastating defeat for the Germans because the army just eventually fell apart. It crumbled. And I think that could very well happen to the Ukrainians. And then the question is, your question, what does the West do? And what can we do militarily? You say we have maybe two choices. One is to escalate, and two is to turn to diplomacy. But what does escalation look like? What's going to happen? I mean, is NATO going to enter the fight at that point in time? I don't think so. I think that we do not have the capability, number one. The European armies are pathetic fighting forces for the most part, especially the British and German armies. The idea that they could go up against the Russian army and defeat the Russian army, I would not bet a lot of money on that. But the more important point, Glenn, as you well know, is that the Russians have many nuclear weapons. And do we want to get into a war where we provoke the Russians into maybe using those nuclear weapons? I do not think so. So I don't think that the West has a military option. I don't see how the West can escalate in any meaningful way. And then you turn to diplomacy. But the problem with diplomacy from the West's point of view is basically what you're doing is negotiating your own defeat. You want to remember that this war is not just Ukraine versus Russia. It's Ukraine plus the West against Russia. And if the Russians roll up the Ukrainian army, conquer a lot more territory, and you decide that you want an armistice, you want to produce a frozen conflict, you want to produce something akin to what happened in Korea in 1953, you're basically pursuing an agreement that reflects the fact that you were defeated. So the fact is that the West and the Ukrainians have no good options whatsoever.
At this point, Mearsheimer reaches what may be the central argument of the entire interview. He contends that if Ukraine's battlefield position continues to weaken, the West faces a strategic dilemma with no easy solution. In his view, large-scale military escalation carries serious risks, while diplomacy would likely require accepting difficult compromises after years of conflict. Whether viewers agree with that assessment or not, his broader point is that the range of available options becomes narrower the longer the war continues, making future decisions increasingly difficult.
When the West fights wars, it has a powerful tendency to demonize the other side, to make the argument that you're up against the devil incarnate. Vladimir Putin becomes Adolf Hitler. Russia becomes Nazi Germany. And the point that you guys were making, which of course is exactly right, is that if you pursue that path, if you describe your adversary in those terms, when it gets time to negotiate with the adversary, it's almost impossible because you're then talking about negotiating with the devil, with Adolf Hitler. And you remember, Glenn, in World War II, we pursued, with regard to Germany, Nazi Germany, and with regard to Imperial Japan, a policy of unconditional surrender. Just think about that, unconditional surrender. Well, if you're pursuing unconditional surrender as your goal, you can't have diplomacy. What you're saying is that the other side has to completely capitulate. And of course, that was because we thought Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany were the devil incarnate. And again, once you believe that, and I'm not arguing it wasn't true in the case of Adolf Hitler, you're not going to get negotiations. And this is what has happened here, as the two of you were describing on your show. We have, especially I think in Europe, more so than in the United States, ended up in a situation where we have described, we in the West, the Russians as the devil incarnate and Putin as the font of all evil. And that makes it, I don't want to say impossible, but it makes it extremely difficult to negotiate.
Mearsheimer argues that successful diplomacy becomes much harder once political leaders portray an opponent as absolute evil. In his view, that kind of wartime messaging can make compromise politically unacceptable, even when negotiations might serve each side's strategic interests. Whether viewers agree or disagree, he presents this as one of the biggest obstacles to ending the conflict.
I think the best deal that the Ukrainians and of course the West as well could get at this point in time is where the Russians only annex the 4 oblasts that they have now annexed. And they don't take places like Kharkiv or oblasts like Kharkiv or Odessa. And the quid pro quo is that Ukraine commits and the West commits to Ukraine being a completely neutral state. And that would remove the Russian incentive to take more territory. And I think you might, and I underline the word might, be able to convince the Russians to stop their acquisition of territory after those 4 oblasts that they've annexed, plus Crimea, of course. But you'd really have to go to enormous lengths to assure the Russians that Ukraine was going to be a truly neutral state. And if there were going to be economic relations between the West and that remaining Ukrainian state, the Russians would also have to be able to have decent economic relations with that Ukrainian state. You really have to fundamentally alter the direction that both the West and Ukraine are headed in terms of their thinking about Ukraine's future, that rump state's future, that is. I think that's the best possible deal that you can get. But, you know, if you look at what's happening, this gets back to our earlier discussion about Ukraine and the West ramping up the long-range drone program. All that does is incentivize the Russians to escalate themselves. And we talked about how they were escalating in terms of shutting off the flow of imports and exports at the Odessa port complex and other places along the Black Sea and turning Ukraine into a landlocked country. Uh, but it's more than that. If you're the West and you're Ukraine and you're escalating, you also incentivize the Russians to take just more physical territory, more oblasts. And you incentivize the Russians to go to great lengths to make sure that uh, that Ukraine is a truly dysfunctional rub state. You go to great lengths, you cause the Russians to go to great lengths to wreck its economy. And of course, that's why you want Ukraine to be landlocked, because that's a good way to wreck its economy. And the more territory you take, the more grain producing regions, the more industrial regions that you take, the more big cities that you take that belong to Ukraine, the more damage you do to Ukraine, the weaker that rump state. And what we're doing is incentivizing the Russians to just take more territory and make that Ukrainian rump state as dysfunctional as possible. And this is why I was saying I think the best deal you could get is if you accept the fact that they've annexed these 4 oblasts and then do everything you can to create a neutral Ukraine. But we don't seem to be going in that direction. So I think in the final analysis, the Russians, assuming that they have the military capability, and I think they do, despite the drones, will end up taking much more territory than they've already annexed.
Whether viewers agree with John Mearsheimer's analysis or not, his central argument is clear. Every new escalation changes the incentives for both sides. He believes the longer the conflict continues without a negotiated settlement, the more territory could change hands and the harder diplomacy becomes. As always, these are the guests' views, and the future of the conflict will ultimately depend on decisions made by all parties involved.